Part 8, Book 2 of From the Founding of the City, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Foundation of the City, Volume 1, by Titus Livius. Translated by George Baker. Book 2, Part 8. This year also produced a tribune hardy enough to make another attempt at carrying the agrarian law. This was Titus Pontificus, who pursued the same method as if it had succeeded, with Spurius Licinius, and for some time obstructed the levy. The patricians being hereby again perplexed, Appius Claudius asserted, that the plan adopted last year had effectually subdued the tribunitian power, for the present, by the very act, and to all future times, by the example, which it had established, since it was discovered how that power might be deprived of efficacy, through the very means supplied by its own strength; for there would, at all times, be one among them, desirous of procuring to himself a superiority over his colleague, and, at the same time, the favor of the better part of the community, by promoting the good of the public. They would even find more than one tribune, if more were necessary, ready to support the consuls, though one would be sufficient against all the rest. Only let the consuls, and principal senators, exert themselves, to secure in the interest of the commonwealth and of the senate, if not all the tribunes, yet as many at least as they could. Convinced of the propriety of Appius's advice, the patricians in general addressed the tribunes with civility and kindness, and those of consular dignity employed whatever personal influence they had over each of them; and thus, partly by conciliating their regard, and partly by the weight of their influence, they prevailed on them to let their powers be directed to the advantage of the state, while the consuls, being supported by 4 tribunes, against one opposer of the public interest, completed the levy. They then marched their army against the Venetians, to whom auxiliaries had flocked from all parts of Etruria, induced to take arms, not so much from affection to the Venetians, as in the hope that the Roman state might be brought to ruin by intestine discord. Accordingly, in the assemblies of each of the states of Etruria, the leading men argued warmly, that the power of the Romans would be everlasting, unless civil dissension armed them with rage against each other. This was the only infection, the only poison that operated, so as to set limits to the duration of great empires. This evil, whose progress had been long retarded, partly by the wise management of the patricians, and partly by the patient conduct of the commons, had now proceeded to extremity. Out of the one were formed 2 distinct states, each of which had its own magistrates, and its own laws. At first, though they used to give a loose rein to their rancorous animosities, when troops were to be levied, yet these very men, as long as war continued, paid obedience to their officers; and while military discipline remained in force, whatever might be the state of affairs in the city, ruin might be deferred. But now the Roman soldier carried with him to the field the custom of refusing submission to superiors. During the last war, in the very heat of battle, the troops conspired to make a voluntary surrender of victory to the vanquished Equians, deserted their standards, forsook their general, and in despite of orders retreated to their camp. Without doubt, if proper exertions were made, Rome might be subdued by means of its own forces. Nothing more was necessary than to make a declaration, and a show of war. The fates and the gods would of themselves accomplish the rest. Such prospects as these had allured the Etrurians to arms, notwithstanding the little success they had experienced in their wars. The Roman consul had no other dread than of the power and the arms of their countrymen. When they reflected on the very dangerous tendency of their misbehavior in the last war, they were deterred from bringing themselves into a situation where they would have 2 armies to fear at the same time. To avoid, therefore, being exposed to this double danger, they kept the troops confined within the camp, in hopes that delay, and time itself, might perhaps soften their resentment, and bring them back to a right way of thinking. This encouraged their enemies the Venetians and Etrurians to act with greater precipitation. At first, they endeavored to provoke the foe to fight, by riding up to the camp, and offering challenges, and at length, finding that this had no effect, by reviling both the consuls and the army, telling them, that the pretense of dissensions among themselves was an artifice contrived to cover their cowardice, that the consuls were more diffident of the courage of their troops than of their disposition to obey orders, that was a strange kind of sedition which showed itself in silence and inaction among men who had arms in their hands; throwing out besides many reproaches, some true and some false, on their upstart origin. Such invectives, though uttered with great vociferation, close to the very rampart and the gates, gave the consuls no matter of uneasiness; but the minds of the uninformed multitude were strongly agitated, at one time by indignation, at another by shame, which diverted them from reflecting on domestic quarrels. They could not bear the thoughts of suffering the enemy to insult them unrevenged, neither could they wish success either to the consuls or to the patricians. Thus there was a struggle in their breasts, between their animosity against foreigners and that which inflamed them against their countrymen. The former at length prevailed, in consequence of the haughty and insolent scoffs of the enemy. They assembled in crowds at the praetorium, demanding the fight, and requiring the signal to be given. The consuls held a consultation together, as if deliberating on the demand, and conferred for a considerable time. They wished to fight, but it was necessary to restrain and conceal that wish, in order, by opposition and delay, to add to the alacrity which had now sprung up in the minds of the troops. They returned for answer, that the measure was premature; it was not yet a proper time for meeting the enemy; that they must keep within the camp. They then issued orders, that all should refrain from fighting, declaring, that if any should engage without orders, they would be punished. After the troops were thus dismissed, their ardor for battle increased, in proportion to the aversion, which they supposed, in the consuls. Besides, the enemy approached with much greater boldness, as soon as it became known that it was determined not to come to an engagement. They thought they might continue their insults with perfect safety, that the soldiers would not be entrusted with arms, that the business would end in a desperate mutiny, and that the final period of the Roman Empire was arrived. Buoyed up with these hopes, their parties pressed forward to the very gates, heaped reproaches on the troops, and hardly refrained from assaulting the camp. But now the Romans could no longer endure such insults; from every quarter of the camp, they ran hastily to the consuls, and did not, as before, propose their demands regularly, through the principal centurions, but joined in one general clamor. The affair was now ripe; yet still the consuls showed a backwardness. But at length beginning, from the increasing uproar, to dread a mutiny, Fabius, with the consent of his colleague, having caused silence by sound of trumpet, said, "Cneius Manlius, that those men are able to conquer, I know, but they themselves have given me reason to doubt, whether it is their wish; for which reason I am determined not to give the signal, unless they swear that they will return from the battle with victory. Soldiers have once deceived a Roman consul in the field, but they will never deceive the gods." There was a centurion, called Marcus Flavolius, who was among the foremost in demanding battle. He cried out, "Marcus Fabius, I will return victorious from the field," and at the same time imprecated on himself the anger of Father Jupiter, of Mars Gradivus, and the other gods, if he did not perform his promise. After him the whole army severally took the same oath. As soon as they had sworn, the signal was given; instantly they marched out to battle, full of rage and of confidence. They bade the Etrurians now throw out their reproaches, now let the enemy, who was so bold in words, come in the way of their arms. There was not a man on that day, either plebeian or patrician, who did not display an uncommon degree of valor. The Fabian name and Fabian race shone forth with peculiar lustre; they were determined to recover, in that battle, the affection of the commons, which, during the many quarrels of the parties at home, had been withdrawn from them. The line was formed; neither did the Venetian enemy or the Etrurian legions decline the combat. These expected, and indeed firmly believed, that the Romans would show no more willingness to fight with them than they had with the Equians; nay, considering the high ferment of their passions, and that in the present case the issue of a battle was the more uncertain, they did not despair of obtaining some important advantage. In this they were entirely disappointed; for in no former war did the Romans enter the field inflamed with keener animosity, so highly were they exasperated by the taunts of the enemy on one side, and the delay of the consuls on the other. The Etrurians had scarcely time to form their ranks, before they found themselves engaged in close fight, hand to hand with swords, the most desperate method of deciding a battle, the javelins having in the first hurry been thrown at random, rather than aimed at the enemy. Among the foremost, the Fabian family particularly attracted the notice of their countrymen, and encouraged them by their example. As one of these, Quintus Fabius, who had been consul 2 years before, advanced before the rest against the thick body of the Venetians, a Tuscan, who assumed resolution from a confidence in his strength and skill in arms, came up to him unobserved, while he was busily engaged with a number of foes, and thrust him through the breast with his sword. On the weapons being drawn out of the wound, Fabius fell to the ground. Both armies felt the fall of this one man, and the Romans were in consequence of it beginning to give ground, when Marcus Fabius, the consul, leaped over the body where it lay, and opposing his buckler to the enemy, called out, "Soldiers, is this what you bound yourselves to perform? Was it that ye would return to the camp in flight? Are ye so much more afraid of the dastardly enemy than of Jupiter and Mars by whom ye swore? But for my part, though bound by no oath, I will either return victorious, or die here, fighting beside thee, Quintus Fabius." On this, Caeso Fabius, consul of the former year, said, "Brother, do you expect by words to prevail on them to fight? The gods by whom they have sworn will prevail on them. Let us, as becomes our noble birth, as is worthy of the Fabian name, animate the men by deeds of valor, rather than by exhortations." The 2 Fabii then rushed forward to the front with their presented spears, and drew the whole line along with them. By these means the battle was renewed on that side; nor in the other wing was Cneius Manlius the consul less strenuous in his efforts against the enemy. Here, too, a like course of events took place; for as the soldiers followed Quintus Fabius with alacrity, so did they here follow the consul Manlius, while he pressed, and almost routed the enemy; and when he was compelled by a severe wound to retire from the field, supposing him slain, they began to shrink. They would indeed have given way entirely, had not the other consul, riding up to the place at full speed with some troops of horse, revived their drooping courage, calling out that his colleague was alive, and that he was come to their support, having defeated the enemy in the other wing. Manlius also showed himself, in order to encourage them to return to the fight. The sight of the 2 consuls rekindled the courage of the soldiers, and by this time, too, the enemy's line was considerably weakened; for, confiding to the superiority of their numbers, they had drawn off a part, and sent them to attack the camp; these met but little resistance in the assault, but wasted time afterwards, being more intent on plunder than on fighting. The Roman Triarii, however, who had not been able to prevent their breaking in at first, and who had dispatched to the consuls an account of their situation, returned in a compact body to the praetorium, and, without waiting for aid, of themselves renewed the combat. At the same time, the consul Manlius, having rode back to the camp, posted troops at all the gates, and blocked up every passage by which the enemy could retreat. The desperate situation in which the Etrurians then saw themselves, inspired them not only with boldness but with fury; so that, after they had made several fruitless efforts, attempting every place where they saw any prospect of gaining a passage, one band of their young men made an attack on Manlius himself, whom they distinguished by his armor. His attendants covered him from the first discharge of their weapons, but could not long withstand their force; the consul, receiving a mortal wound, fell, and his defenders were entirely dispersed. This added a new confidence to the Etrurians, and so dispirited the Romans, that they fled in dismay, through all parts of the camp, and would probably have been utterly ruined, had not the lieutenant generals, hastily removing the consul's body, opened a passage for the enemy by one of the gates. Through this they rushed out, and, as they were retreating in the utmost disorder, fell in with Fabius, who was flushed with success. In this second encounter many were cut off, and the rest fled different ways. The victory was complete, but the joy which it occasioned was greatly damped by the death of 2 such illustrious persons as Fabius and Manlius; for which reason the consul, when the Senate were proceeding to vote him a triumph, told them, that if the army could triumph without their general, he would readily consent to it, on account of their extraordinary good behavior in that war; but as to himself, while his own family was overwhelmed with grief, for the death of his brother Quintus Fabius, and the commonwealth bewailed the loss of a parent, as it were, in that of one of its consuls, he would not accept the laurel, blasted both by public and private mourning. A triumph refused on such grounds, redounded more to his honor, than if he had actually enjoyed it. So true it is, that fame prudently declined, often breaks forth with increased lustre. He then celebrated the two funerals of his colleague and his brother, one after the other, and took upon himself the office of pronouncing the panegyric of both, in which he attributed to them the merit of his own performances, in such a manner as showed him to be entitled to the greatest share of any. Not losing sight of the design which he had conceived at the beginning of his consulate, of recovering the affection of the commons, he distributed the wounded soldiers among the patricians, to be taken care of until they were cured. The greater number were given to the Fabii, and by no others were they treated with more attention. Henceforward the Fabii grew high in the favor of the people, and that without any practices prejudicial to the state. With the same view, Caeso Fabius, whose election to the consulship, with Titus Virginius, was owing as much to the support of the commons as to that of the patricians, would enter on no business, either of wars or levies, or any other matter, until the hopes of concord, which had already made some progress, should be ripened into a perfect union between the plebeians and patricians. In the beginning of the year, therefore, he proposed, that before any tribune should stand forth to press the agrarian law, the Senate should seize the opportunity, and take to themselves the merit of conferring that favor; that they should distribute among the commons, in as equal proportions as possible, the lands taken from their enemies, for it was but just that they should be enjoyed by those whose blood and labor acquired them. The Senate rejected the proposal with disdain; some of them even complained, that the talents of Caeso, formerly so brilliant, were, through a surfeit of glory, become heavy and languid. No disputes ensued between the factions in the city. The Latines were harassed by incursions of the Equians; Caeso being sent thither, with an army, retaliated on the Equians, by ravaging their territories. They retired into the towns, and kept themselves within the walls; consequently, there was no battle of any importance. But from the arms of the Venetians a severer blow was received, through the rashness of the other consul, and the army would have been utterly destroyed, had not Caeso Fabius arrived seasonably to its support. From that time there was properly neither peace nor war with the Venetians, whose proceedings were more like those of a banditti, than of regular troops. On the approach of the Roman legions, they retreated into the town, and when they understood that those were withdrawn, they made incursions into the country, shifting alternately from war to quiet, and from quiet to war. For this reason, nothing could be brought to a conclusion. There was also apprehension of other wars, two of which were just ready to break out, that is, with the Equians and Volscians, who only remained inactive until the smart of their late disaster should wear off; and besides, it was evident that the Sabines, ever hostile, and all Etruria, would soon be in motion. But the Venetians kept the Romans in continual uneasiness, rather indeed by frequent insults, than by any enterprise which threatened danger; yet this was such a business as would neither allow them to neglect it at any time, nor to turn their attention to other matters. While affairs were in this state, the Fabian family addressed the Senate, the consul, in the name of the whole, speaking in this manner: "Conscript fathers, you know that the Venetian war requires rather an established than a strong force, on the frontiers; let your care be directed to other wars; commit to the Fabii that against the Venetians. We pledge ourselves, that the majesty of the Roman name shall be safe on that side; that war, as the particular province of our family, we propose to wage at our own private expense. The state shall not be troubled either for men or money to support it." The warmest thanks were given to them, and the consul, coming out of the Senate, returned to his house, accompanied by the Fabii in a body, who had stood in the porch of the Senate house, waiting the Senate's determination. They received orders to attend next day in arms, at the consul's gate, and then retired to their respective homes. The report of this conduct spread immediately over the whole city, and all extolled the Fabii with the most exalted encomiums: that a single family had undertaken to sustain the burden of the state; that the Venetian war was to become a private concern, a private quarrel. If there were two other families of equal strength in the city, one of them might claim the Volscians for their share, the other the Equians; thus all the neighboring states might be subdued, and the majority of Roman people, in the meantime, enjoy perfect tranquillity. Next day the Fabii took arms, and assembled in the place appointed. The consul, coming forth in his military robe, saw his whole family in the courtyard, drawn up in order of march, and being received into the centre, commanded to set them forward. Never did an army, either smaller or more highly distinguished in fame, and the general admiration of all men, march through the city. 306 soldiers, all of them patricians, not one of whom would be judged unfit for supreme command by the Senate at any time whatever, proceeded on their way, threatening destruction to the state of the Venetians by the prowess of one family. A crowd attended them, composed partly of their own connections, relations, and particular acquaintances, who held no moderation either in their hopes or anxieties, and partly of such as were attracted by the zeal for the public interest, all enraptured with esteem and admiration. They bade the heroes to proceed with happy fortune, and to obtain success proportioned to the merit of their undertaking, desiring them to expect afterwards consulships, triumphs, every reward, every honor, which was in the power of the public to bestow. As they passed by the Capitol, the citadel, and other sacred places, whatever deities occurred to the people's sights or thoughts, to them they offered up their prayers, that they would crown that band with success and prosperity, and soon restore them in safety to their country and their parents. But their prayers were made in vain. Passing through the right-hand postern of the Carmental Gate, they arrived at the river Cremera, which they judged to be a proper situation for securing a post by fortifications. Lucius Aemilius and Caius Servilius were soon after elected consuls. As long as the operations of the war were confined to predatory expeditions, the Fabii were not only sufficiently able to defend their post, but by their excursions, along the common boundaries, they both effectually secured their own frontiers, and spread terror and devastation in those of the enemy, through the whole tract, as far as the Etrurian territories join the Roman. Their mutual depredations were soon after discontinued, though but for a short time, for the Venetians having collected a reinforcement from Etruria, laid siege to the post at Cremera, and the Roman legions led thither by the consul Lucius Aemilius fought a close engagement with the Etrurians in the field, in which, however, the Venetians had scarcely time to form their troops, for in the midst of the hurry, while they were taking their posts under their several banners, and placing bodies of reserve, a brigade of Roman cavalry charged them suddenly on the flank, in such manner as to put it out of their power either to make a regular onset, or even to stand their ground. Being thus compelled to retreat to the Red Rocks, where they had their camp, they humbly sued for peace; yet after it had been granted they renounced it, before the Roman guard was withdrawn from the Cremera: such was their natural inconsistency, and such their bad faith. End of Book 2, Part 8. Part 9, Book 2 of From the Founding of the City, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Foundation of the City, Volume 1, by Titus Livius, translated by George Baker. Book 2, Part 9. The contest, then, again lay between the Fabii and the Venetian state, unsupported by any additional forces on either side. There passed between them not only incursions into each other's territories, and sudden attacks on the parties employed in those incursions, but several pitched battles in the open field, in which a single family of the Roman people often obtained a victory over a state, at that time the most powerful in Etruria. This at first stung the Venetians with grief and indignation; afterwards they formed a design, suggested by the present circumstances, of ensnaring their enemy, elated with success; and they even observed, with pleasure, the confidence of the Fabii daily increasing, from a series of successful attempts. In pursuance of this design, cattle were frequently driven in the way of the plundering parties, as if they had come there by chance; the fields were deserted, by the flight of the peasants; and the bodies of troops, sent to repel the invaders, retreated with pretended, oftener than real, fear. The Fabii had now contracted such a contempt of the enemy, that they thought their own arms invincible, and not to be withstood in any place or on any occasion. This presumption carried them so far, that on seeing from Cremera some cattle at a distance, a long tract of country lying between, in which, however, but few of the enemy's troops appeared, they ran down to seize them, and pressed forward with such careless haste as to pass by the Veientians, who lay in ambush on each side of the very road through which they marched. They then dispersed themselves on all sides to collect the cattle, which ran up and down, as was natural on being frightened, when suddenly the soldiers rose from their concealments, and appeared not only in front, but on every side of them. The shout first struck them with terror, and in a little time they were assailed by weapons on all sides. As the Etrurians closed in upon them, they were obliged, hemmed in as they were, by one continued line of troops, to contract the circle which they had formed, into a narrower compass, which circumstance showed plainly, both the smallness of their number and the great superiority of the Etrurians, whose ranks were multiplied as the space grew narrower. They then changed their method of fighting, and instead of making head on all sides, bent their whole force towards one point, where, forming in the shape of a wedge, and exerting every effort of their bodies and arms, they at length forced a passage. Their course led to a hill of moderate acclivity; there first they halted, and then the advantage of the ground affording them a little time to breathe, and to recover from the consternation into which they had been thrown, they afterwards even repulsed an attack of the enemy, and this little band would probably, with the aid of the ground, have come off victorious, had not a body of Veientians sent round the ridge of the hill, made their way to the summit, by which means the enemy became again superior. The Fabii were all cut off to a man, and their fort taken. It is agreed on all hands that the 306 perished; that only one single person, then quite a youth, was left, as a stock for the propagation of the Fabian race, and who was afterwards, on many emergencies, both in peace and war, to prove the firmest support of the state. At the time when this disaster happened, Caius Horatius and Titus Menenius were in the consulship. Menenius was immediately sent against the Etrurians, elated with their victory. He also was worsted in battle, and the enemy took possession of the Janiculum; nor would the city, which, besides the war, was distressed also by scarcity, have escaped a siege, the Etrurians having passed the Tiber, had not the consul Horatius been recalled from the country of the Volscians. So near, indeed, did the enemy approach to the walls, that the first engagement was at the Temple of Hope, in which little was gained on either side, and the second at the Colline Gate, in which the Romans obtained some small advantage; and this, though far from decisive, yet, by restoring to the soldiers their former courage, qualified them the better to contend with the enemy in future. Aulus Virginius and Spurius Servilius were next elected consuls. After the loss sustained in the last battle, the Veientians avoided coming again to an engagement. They employed themselves in committing depredations, by sending out parties from the Janiculum, which served them as a fortress; and these parties scoured every part of the Roman territories, so that neither the cattle nor the husbandmen could anywhere remain in safety. At last they were entrapped by the same stratagem by which they had circumvented the Fabii. Pursuing some cattle, which had been purposely thrown in their way as a temptation, they fell into an ambuscade. In proportion as their numbers were greater, so was the slaughter. The violent rage which this overthrow excited, gave cause to one of greater magnitude; for, having crossed the Tiber by night, they made an assault on the camp of the consul Servilius, and being repulsed with great loss, with difficulty effected a retreat to the Janiculum. The consul immediately passed the Tiber, and fortified a camp at the foot of the Janiculum. Next day, as soon as light appeared, partly led by the confidence inspired by his success in the fight of the day before, but chiefly because the scarcity of corn made it expedient to adopt even dangerous measures, provided they were expeditious, he rashly marched up his troops against the steep of the Janiculum, to the camp of the enemy. There he met with a repulse, more shameful than that which he had given them the preceding day; and both he and his army owed their preservation from destruction to the timely intervention of his colleague. The Etrurians, now enclosed between the two armies, to one or other of which their rear was by turns exposed, were entirely cut off. Thus, through a fortunate act of temerity, the Veientians were effectually overpowered, and the war brought to a conclusion. Together with peace, plenty returned to the city, corn being brought from Campania, and every one, as soon as he was freed from the dread of impending famine, producing the stores which he had concealed. In this state of abundance and ease, the people began again to grow licentious, and not finding abroad any cause of complaint, sought for it, as usual, at home. By infusing into their minds the usual poison, the agrarian law, the tribunes threw the people into a ferment, at the same time rousing their resentment against the patricians who opposed it, and not only against that body in general, but against particular members of it. Quintus Considius and Titus Genixtius, the present proposers of the agrarian law, lodged an accusation against Titus Menenius. The charge brought against him was, the loss of the fort of Cremera, when he, the consul, was encamped in a fixed post at no great distance. Him they crushed, although the patricians struggled in his cause with no less zeal than they had shown for Coriolanus, and though his father Agrippa's title to the favour of the public was not yet forgotten. The tribunes, however, went no farther than to impose a fine, though they had carried on the prosecution as for a capital offence. On his being found guilty, they fixed the mulct at 2,000 asses. This proved fatal to him, for we are told that he could not bear the ignominy and anguish of mind which it occasioned, and that this threw him into a disorder which put an end to his life. Another was soon after brought to trial, Spurius Servilius, against whom, as soon as he went out of the consulship, in the beginning of the year in which Caius Nautius and Publius Valerius were consuls, a prosecution was commenced by two tribunes, Lucius Caedicius and Titus Statius. He did not, like Menenius, meet the attacks of these tribunes with supplications from himself and the patricians, but with the utmost confidence, inspired by innocence, and by the justice of his claim to the favour of the public. He was charged with misconduct in the battle with the Etrurians at the Janiculum; but being a man of an intrepid spirit, as he had done formerly in the case of public peril, so now in one that threatened himself, he dispelled the danger by facing it with boldness. In a speech full of undaunted fortitude, he retorted on both tribunes and commons, and upbraided them with the condemnation and death of Titus Menenius, the son of that man, to whose good offices the people stood indebted for the restoration of their privileges, for those very laws and magistrates which enabled them now to let loose their passions in this unreasonable manner. His colleague Virginius, too, being produced as a witness, greatly assisted his cause, by attributing to him a share of his own merit; but what did him the most essential service was, the sentence passed on Menenius, so great a change had taken place in the minds of the people. No sooner had these domestic disputes subsided than a new war broke out with the Veientians, with whom the Sabines had united their forces. After auxiliaries had been brought from the Latines and Hernicians, the consul Valerius, being sent with an army to Veii, instantly attacked the Sabine camp, which they had pitched under the walls of their allies. This occasioned such consternation among the Sabines, that while they ran different ways in small parties, to repel the enemy's assault, the gate, first attacked, was taken, and afterwards, within the rampart, there was rather a carnage than a battle. From the tents the alarm spread into the city, and the Veientians ran to arms in as great a panic as if Veii itself were taken. Some went to support the Sabines, others fell upon the Romans, whose whole force and attention were employed on the camp. For a little time the latter were put to a stand and disordered, but soon forming two fronts, they faced the enemy on both sides, and at the same time, the cavalry being ordered by the consul to charge, routed and dispersed the Etrurians. Thus were overcome, in the same hour, two armies of the two greatest and most powerful of the neighbouring states. During these transactions at Veii, the Volscians and Aquans had encamped in the Latine territories, and laid waste the country. The Latines, however, being joined by the Hernicians, without the aid either of Roman general or troops, beat them out of their camp, and there, besides recovering their own effects, got possession of immense booty. The consul Caius Nautius was, however, sent against the Volscians from Rome, where, I suppose, it was considered as improper that the allies should get a custom of carrying on wars, with their own forces and under their own direction, without a Roman general and troops. Every kind of severity and indignity was practised against the Volscians, yet they could not be brought to an engagement in the field. The next consuls were Lucius Furius and Aulus Manlius. The Veientians fell to the lot of Manlius as his province, but the war with that people did not continue. At their request, a truce for 40 years was granted them, and they were obliged to furnish corn, and to pay the soldiers. No sooner was peace restored abroad, than discord began at home. The commons were set in a flame at the instigation of the tribunes, on their constant subject, the agrarian law, which the consuls, not deterred by the condemnation of Menenius or the danger incurred by Servilius, opposed with all their might. On this account, as soon as they went out of office, Titus Ganusius, the tribune, laid hold of them. They were succeeded in the consulship by Lucius Aemilius and Opitor Reginius. In some annals, instead of Reginius, I find Vopiscus Julius set down for consul. During this year, whoever were the consuls, Furius and Manlius being summoned to a trial before the people, went about in the garb of suppliants, addressing not only the commons but the younger patricians. The latter they advised and cautioned to keep at a distance from public employments, and the administration of affairs, and to look on the consular fasces, the praetexta, and curule chair as nothing better than the decorations of a funeral, for those splendid badges, like the fillets of victims, were placed on men who were doomed to death. But if there were such charms in the consulship, let them once for all be convinced that the office was crushed and held in captivity by the tribunitian power, that a consul must act in everything according to command, and, like a bailiff, be obedient even to the tribune's nod. If he should show any respect to the patricians, if he should suppose that there was any powerful part in the state but the commons alone, let him place before his eyes the banishment of Caius Marcius, with the penalty and death of Menenius. By such discourses the patricians were fired with indignation, and from that time they no longer held their consultations publicly but in private, and suffered but now to be privy to them. And here, however they might differ in other points, in this they were unanimous, that the accused should be rescued from danger by any means possible, whether right or wrong, and the most violent method proposed was the most acceptable. Nor were they at a loss for an actor to perpetrate any the most atrocious deed. On the day of trial, therefore, the people, standing in the forum, in eager expectation of the tribune's appearing, first began to wonder that he did not come down; then, beginning from his delay, to suspect something amiss, they supposed that he had been terrified from attending by the nobles, while some complained that the cause of the public was deserted and betrayed by him. At length, an account was brought of the tribune's being found dead in his house. As soon as this report had spread through the assembly, every one separated different ways, just as an army disperses on the fall of its leader. The tribunes, particularly, were seized with the greatest terror, warned by the death of their colleague how very little security the devoting laws afforded them. The patricians, on the other side, exulted with too little moderation, and so far were they from feeling any compunction at the deed, that even those who were clear of the crime wished to be considered as the perpetrators of it, and they declared openly that the tribunitian power must be subdued by severity. Soon after this victory had been obtained, by means which furnished a precedent of the worst tendency, a proclamation was issued for a levy of soldiers, and the tribunes, being awed into submission, the consuls accomplished the business without any interruption. The commons, on this, were highly enraged, more on account of the acquiescence of the tribunes than of the execution of the orders of the consuls. They declared that there was an end of their liberty, that they were reduced again to their old condition, for the tribunitian power had expired with, and was buried in the grave, of Genusius. Other means must be devised and practised, to put a stop to the tyranny of the patricians. There remained now only one method to be pursued, which was, that the commons, since they were destitute of every other protection, should undertake their own defence. The retinue of the consuls consisted of 24 lictors, and even these were plebeians; no force could be more contemptible or less capable of resistance, if people had but the spirit to despise them; but every one magnified those matters, and made them objects of terror to himself. While they thus spurred on each other with such discourses as these, it happened that a lictor was sent by the consul to a plebeian of the name of Valero Publilius, who had insisted, that having been a centurion, he could not be compelled to enlist as a common soldier. Valero appealed to the tribunes, but none of them supporting him, the consuls ordered the man to be stripped, and the rods to be got ready. "I appeal to the people," said Valero; "the tribunes chose rather that a Roman citizen should be beaten with rods before their eyes, than that themselves should be murdered in their beds by your faction." The more vehemently he exclaimed, the more violently did the lictor proceed in tearing off his clothes, and stripping him. Then Valero, who was a man of great bodily strength, and aided also by those who took part with him, drove away the lictor, and retired into the thickest part of the crowd, where he heard the loudest expressions of indignation at the treatment which he received, at the same time crying aloud, "I appeal and implore the protection of the commons. Support me, citizens, support me, fellow soldiers. You have nothing to expect from the tribunes, who themselves stand in need of your support." The people, inflamed with passion, prepared themselves as for a battle; and there was every appearance of the contest proceeding to such extremity that no regard whatever would be paid either to public or private rights. The consuls, having undertaken to face this violent storm, quickly experienced that dignity, unsupported by strength, is not exempt from danger. Their lictors were abused, the fasces broken, and themselves forced to take refuge in the Senate house, uncertain how far Valero would push his victory. In some time after, the tumult subsiding, they assembled the senators, and complained to them of the ill treatment which they had suffered, of the violence of the commons, and the audacious behavior of Valero. Though many harsh methods of proceeding were proposed, the opinion of the elder members prevailed, who recommended to the Senate not to let their conduct be as strongly marked by passionate resentment as that of the commons was by inconsiderate violence. The commons, interesting themselves warmly in favor of Valero, chose him at the next election tribune for the year, the consuls being Lucius Pinarius and Publius Furius; and now, contrary to the expectation of all men, who supposed that he would give a loose to the reins of the tribunician power in harassing the consuls of the preceding year, postponing his own resentment, and affecting only the public interest, without uttering even a word to offend the consuls, he proposed a law that plebeian magistrates should be elected in assemblies where the votes were given by tribes. This, though covered under an appearance which, at first, showed not any evil tendency, was considered as a matter of no trivial consequence, as it would entirely deprive the patricians of the power of electing such tribunes as they liked, by means of the votes of their dependents. To prevent this proposition, which was highly pleasing to the commons, from passing into a law, the patricians strained every nerve; and though neither the influence of the consuls nor that of themselves could prevail on any one of the college of tribunes to protest against it, that being the only power that could effectually stifle it, yet, as it was in itself an affair of great weight, and required long and laborious exertions, the obstacles thrown in its way were sufficient to delay it until the following year. The commons re elected Valero to the tribuneship, and the patricians, judging that this business would not end without the severest struggle, procured the consulship for Appius Claudius, son of Appius, who both hated and was hated by the commons, in consequence of the contentions between them and his father. Titus Quintius was given him for colleague. The law was the first matter agitated in the beginning of the year, and though Valero was the author of it, yet Latorius, his colleague, from having more recently joined in the business, became in consequence the more eager for its adoption. His renown in war inspired him with confidence, for there was no one of that age possessed of more personal prowess. Valero contented himself with arguing in favor of the law, and avoided all abuse against the consuls; but Latorius began with severe invectives against Appius and his family, charging them with having always shown a disposition in the highest degree overbearing and cruel, asserting that the patricians had elected him not for a consul, but an executioner, to torment and torture the plebeians. Being, however, a rough soldier, unskilled in the art of speaking, he was at a loss for expressions suited to the boldness of his thoughts, and finding himself unable to proceed in his discourse, he said, "Citizens, since I cannot speak with the same readiness with which I can perform what I have spoken, I request your attendance to morrow. Either I will lose my life, here in your presence, or I will carry the law." Next day, the tribunes took possession of the temple, and the consuls and nobles placed themselves among the crowd, in order to oppose the law. Litorius ordered all persons to retire, except those who were to vote; but the younger nobility kept their seats, and paid no regard to the officer; on which Litorius ordered some of them to be taken into custody. The consul Appius insisted, that a tribune had no power over any but the plebeians; for he was not a magistrate of the people at large, but of the commons; that even he himself could not, conformably to ancient usage, of his own authority compel people to withdraw, the words in use being, "If ye think proper, Romans, retire." It was easy for him to disconcert Litorius in arguing, even thus contemptuously, about his authority. The tribune, therefore, inflamed with anger, sent one of his officers to the consul, while the consul sent a lictor to the tribune, calling out that he was but a private person without command and without magistracy; nor would the tribune have escaped ill treatment, had not the whole assembly joined with great warmth in taking his part against the consul; and at the same time, the alarm having spread among the populace, brought a great concourse from all parts of the city to the Forum. Appius, notwithstanding, inflexibly withstood the violence of the storm; and the dispute must have terminated in blood, had not Quintius, the other consul, giving it in charge to the consulars to take away his colleague from the Forum by force, if they could not do it otherwise, now soothing the enraged plebeians with entreaties, then begging the tribunes to dismiss the assembly, so as to give time for their anger to cool, telling them, that delay would not diminish aught of their power, but would afford them the advantage of uniting prudence with that power; that the patrician would still be under the direction of the people, and the consul under that of the patricians. End of Book 2, Part 9. Part 10, Book 2, of From the Founding of the City, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Foundation of the City, Volume 1, by Titus Livius. Translated by George Baker. Book 2, Part 10. With great difficulty the commons were pacified by Quintius, and with much greater was the other consul quieted by the patricians; and the assembly of the people being at length dismissed, the consuls convened the senate. There, fear and anger prevailing by turns, produced for some time a variety of opinions; but having gained time for reflection, in proportion as passion gave place to reason, they became more and more averse from inflammatory measures, insomuch that they returned thanks to Quintius, for having by his exertions put a stop to the quarrel. Appius they requested to be satisfied with such a degree of deference to the consular authority as was compatible with concord between the several parts of the state; for, whilst the tribune and consuls violently drew all power, each to their own side, there was none left in the other members of the community. The object of the dispute was not the safety of the commonwealth, but who should have the disposal of it, mangled and torn as it was. On the other hand, Appius appealed to gods and men, that the state was betrayed and deserted through cowardice; that the consul was not wanting in support of the senate, but the senate in support of the consul; and that they were submitting to more grievous laws than those which were imposed at the Sacred Mount. Yielding, however, to the unanimous judgment of the senate, he desisted, and the law was carried through without farther opposition. Then for the first time were the tribunes elected in an assembly of the people, voting by tribes. Piso relates also, that there were 3 added to their number, having before been but 2. He even names the tribunes, Caius Cinicius, Lucius Numitorius, Marcus Duilius, Spurius Icilius, Lucius Massilius. During the dissensions at Rome, war commenced with the Equians and Volscians, who had committed depredations on the Roman lands, with design that if the commons should again think proper to secede, they might find a refuge with them. When the differences in the city were afterwards composed, they removed their camp to a greater distance; Appius Claudius was sent against the Volscians; the Equians fell to Quintius as his province. The same severity, which Appius had shown at home, he practised at the head of the army abroad, and even with less reserve, as he was out of the reach of any control from the tribunes. He detested the commons to a degree of rancor, even beyond what he inherited from his father, and considered himself as vanquished by them; for that when he had been set up as the only person, who, in the character of consul, was qualified to oppose the tribunitian power, that law had been carried which the former consuls had been able to prevent, though they made not such strenuous exertions as himself against it, nor did the patricians expect so much from them. His anger and indignation hereby excited, he sought to wreak on the army every kind of rigor which the command had put in his power; but no degree of violence was able to subdue the temper of the troops, such an unconquerable spirit of opposition had they imbibed. In every part of their business they showed indolence and carelessness, negligence and stubbornness; neither shame nor fear had any effect on them. If he wished that the army should proceed with more expedition, they marched the slower; if he came to encourage them to hasten their work, every one relaxed the diligence which he had used before; when he was present, they cast down their eyes; as he passed by, they muttered curses against him; so that while he seemed invulnerable to popular dislike, his mind was occasionally affected with disagreeable emotions. After trying every kind of harsh treatment without effect, he renounced all intercourse with the soldiers, declaring that the army was corrupted by the centurions, whom, in a gibing manner, he sometimes called plebeian tribunes, and voleros. Not one of these circumstances was unknown to the Volscians, who, for that reason, pressed forward their operations the more vigorously, in hopes that the Roman army would be animated with the same spirit of opposition against Appius which they had formerly displayed against Fabius, when consul; and, in fact, in Appius's case, it showed itself with a much greater degree of inveteracy than in that of Fabius; for they were not only unwilling to conquer, like Fabius's troops, but even chose to be conquered. When led out to the field, they fled shamefully to their camp, nor made a halt, until they saw the Volscians advancing to the rampart, and committing great slaughter on the rear of the army. The necessity of repelling the victorious enemy from the rampart, then prevailed on them to fight; which, however, they did in such a manner, as made it evident, that they acted only because Roman soldiers would not suffer their camp to be taken; in other respects, they rejoiced at their own losses and disgrace. All this had so little effect towards softening the stubborn fierceness of Appius, that he resolved to exhibit farther examples of severity; but when he had summoned an assembly for the purpose, the lieutenant generals and tribunes gathered hastily about him, and cautioned him not to hazard a trial of the extent of an authority whose whole efficacy depended on the will of those who were to obey it; informed him, that the soldiers in general declared that they would not attend the assembly, and that in every quarter, they were heard loudly demanding the camp should be removed out of the Volscian territories. They reminded him that the conquering army had approached almost to the gates and to the rampart, and that if he persisted, there was not only reason to apprehend, but every certain indication of a most grievous calamity ensuing. At length yielding to persuasion, as nothing but a delay of punishment could be the consequence, he prorogued the assembly, gave orders that the troops should be in readiness to march next day, and at the first dawn, gave, by sound of trumpet, the signal for setting out. When the army had scarcely got clear of the camp, and while they were just forming in order of march, the Volscians, as if they had been summoned by the same signal, made an attack on their rear, and the alarm spreading from thence to the van, caused such consternation, as threw both the battalions and ranks into confusion, so that neither could orders be heard nor a line formed. No one now thought of anything but flight, and with such precipitation did they make their way through the ranks, that the enemy ceased to pursue sooner than the Romans to fly. In vain did the consul follow his men, calling them to halt. But when he had at length collected them together, he encamped in a peaceful part of the country, and there, having summoned an assembly, after uttering severe and just reproaches against the army as betrayers of military discipline, and deserters from their posts, asking each where were their standards, where were their arms, he beat with rods and beheaded the soldiers who had thrown away their swords, the standard bearers who had lost their ensigns, and also such of the centurions and of the privates as had quitted their ranks. Of the rest of the multitude every 10th man was drawn by lot and punished. In a very different manner were matters conducted in the country of the Equians. There seemed a mutual contest carried on between the consul and his troops, who should exceed the other in civility and good offices. Quintius was naturally of a milder disposition, and besides, the ill consequences attending the harshness of his colleague made him feel the greater satisfaction in indulging his own temper. The Equians, not daring to meet in the field a general and army so cordially united, suffered them to carry their depredations through every part of the country; and in no former war was a greater abundance of booty brought off from thence, all which was distributed among the soldiers. Their behavior was also rewarded with praises, in which the minds of soldiers find as much delight as in gain. The troops returned home in better temper towards their general, and on the general's account, towards the patricians also, declaring that the Senate had given to them a parent, to the other army a master. This year, during which they experienced a variety of fortune in their military operations, and furious dissensions both at home and abroad, was particularly distinguished by the assemblies of the people voting by tribes, a matter which derived its seeming importance rather from the honor of the victory obtained by one party over the other, than from any real advantage accruing from it. For the share of power which was either gained by the commons or taken from the patricians was trifling, in proportion to the great degree of dignity of which the assemblies themselves were deprived by the execution of the patricians. The following year, the consulate of Lucius Valerius and Tiberius Aemilius was disturbed by more violent commotions, both in consequence of the struggles between the different orders of the state concerning the agrarian law, and also of the trial of Appius Claudius, who, having taken a most active part in opposition to the law, and supported the cause of those who were in possession of the public lands, as if he were a third consul, and thought it his duty, had a criminal prosecution instituted against him by Marcus Julius and Caius Sicinius. Never hitherto had a person, so odious to the commons, been brought to trial before the people, overwhelmed as he was with their hatred, on his father's account, besides the load which his own conduct had drawn on him; and hardly ever did the patricians exert such strenuous efforts in favor of any other, seeing this champion of the Senate, the asserter of its dignity, their bulwark against the outrageous attempts both of tribunes and commons, exposed to the rage of the populace, only for having in the contest exceeded in some degree, as they conceived, the bounds of moderation. Appius Claudius himself was the only one among the patricians who looked with scorn on the tribunes and commons, even affecting a disregard as to his own trial. Neither the threats of the commons, nor the entreaties of the Senate, could ever prevail on him either to change its garb, or use a suppliant address, or even to soften and relax in any degree the usual harshness of his language, when he was to plead his cause before the people. He still preserved the same expression of countenance, the same stubborn fierceness in his looks, and the same vehemence in his discourse; so that a great many of the commons felt to less dread of Appius, while he stood a culprit at their bar, than they had done when he was consul. He pleaded in his defence, and that with all the haughtiness which he could have shown, had he been the accuser, just as he used to behave on every other occasion, and by his intrepidity so astonished the tribunes and commons, that of their own choice they adjourned the trial to another day, and afterwards suffered the business to cool. The day of adjournment was not very distant, yet before it arrived he was seized with a disorder and died. The tribunes endeavored to prevent his being honored with a funeral panegyric, but the commons would not allow that the last day of so great a man should be defrauded of the usual glories. They listened to the encomiums pronounced on him after his death with as favorable an attention as they had shown to the charges brought against him when alive, and in vast numbers attended his funeral. During this year, the consul Valerius marched with an army against the Equians, and finding it impracticable to entice them to an engagement, made an assault on their camp. A violent storm of thunder and hail obliged him to desist, and people's surprise was increased, when, as soon as the signal for retreat had been given, the weather became perfectly calm and clear; so that they were deterred by a religious scruple from again attacking a camp which had been defended by an evident interposition of some divinity, and vented all their rage in devastation on the enemy's lands. The other consul Aemilius conducted the war in the country of the Sabines, and there also, the enemy keeping within their walls, the lands were laid waste, at length, by the burning, not only of the country houses, but of the villages, which in that populous country were very numerous, the Sabines being provoked to give battle to the troops employed in the depredations, and, being obliged to retreat without having gained any advantage, removed their camp next day to a place of greater safety. This appeared to the consul a sufficient reason to consider the enemy as vanquished, and to cease any further operations; he accordingly withdrew his men, without having made any progress in the war. While these wars still raged abroad, and party divisions at home, Titus Numitius Priscus and Aulus Virginius were elected consuls. There was reason to believe that the commons would not endure any farther delay with respect to the agrarian law, and every degree of violence was ready to be committed, when it was discovered, by the smoke from the burning of the country houses, and by the inhabitants flying to the city, that the Volscians were at hand. This incident repressed the sedition, when just ripe, and on the point of breaking forth. The consuls were instantly ordered by the Senate to lead out the youth from the city against the enemy, and this made the rest of the commons less turbulent. On the other side, the assailants, without performing any thing farther than alarming the Romans by the destruction of some few buildings, retired with great precipitation. Numitius marched to Antium against the Volscians, Virginius against the Equians. Here, the army falling into an ambuscade, and being in the utmost danger of a total overthrow, was rescued by the bravery of the soldiers from the imminent peril to which the carelessness of the consul had exposed them. The operations against the Volscians were better conducted. In the first engagement, the enemy were routed, and compelled to fly into Antium, which, considering those times, was a city of great strength. The consul, therefore, not choosing to venture to attack it, took from the Antians another town called Seno, which was not near so strong. Whilst the Equians and Volscians gave employment to the Roman armies, the Sabines carried depredation to the very gates of the city. However, they themselves, in a few days after, suffered, from the two Roman armies, greater losses than any which they had occasioned, both the consuls, provoked at their proceedings, having marched into their territories. Towards the close of the year there was some interval of peace, but disturbed, as was always the case, by struggles between the patricians and plebeians. The latter were so incensed that they refused to attend the assembly held for the election of consuls, so that by the votes of the patricians and their dependents, Titus Quintius and Quintus Servilius were appointed to the consulship. These experienced a year similar to the preceding, the beginning of it filled with civil broils, which were afterwards repressed by the breaking out of foreign wars. The Sabines, marching across the plains of Crustuminium with great rapidity, carried fire and sword through all the country on the banks of the Anio, and though, when they had advanced almost to the Colline gate, and the walls of the city, they met with a repulse, yet they carried off a vast booty both of men and cattle. The consul Servilius marched in pursuit, with design to bring them to an engagement, but not being able to overtake their main body in the Champagne country, he spread devastation to such an extent as to leave nothing unmolested, and returned with a quantity of spoil, exceeding by many degrees what the enemy had carried off. In the campaign against the Volscians also, the arms of the state were remarkably successful, through the conduct both of the general and of the soldiers. First they fought a pitched battle, on equal ground, with great loss of blood on both sides. The Romans, however, whose small number made them feel the loss more sensibly, would have quitted the field, had not the consul, by a happy feint, reanimated the troops, calling out that the enemy were flying on the other wing. They then returned to the charge, and the opinion that victory was on their side was the means of their obtaining it in reality. But Titus, fearing lest, if he pressed the fugitives too far, he might have the battle to fight over again, gave the signal for retreat. After this, an interval of some few days passed, during which both parties reposed, as if they had tacitly agreed to a suspension of arms; and in the meantime, vast multitudes from every state of the Volscians and Equians flocked to their camp, not doubting but that the Romans, when informed of their numbers, would make their retreat by night. About the third watch, therefore, they came to attack the camp. Quintius, after appeasing the tumult which the sudden alarm had excited, and ordering the soldiers to stay quiet in their tents, led out a cohort of Hernicians to form an advance guard, mounted the trumpeters, with others of their band, on horses, and ordered them to sound their instruments before the rampart. so as to keep the enemy in suspense until daylight. During the remainder of the night, everything was quiet in the camp, so that the Romans were not even prevented from sleeping. The Volscians, on the other hand, expecting every instant an attack, were kept in a state of earnest attention by the appearance of the armed infantry, whom they believed to be Romans, and whom they also conceived to be more numerous than they really were, from the bustle and neighing of the horses, and which, being under the management of riders with whom they were acquainted, and having their ears continually teased with the sound of the instruments, made in their trampling a considerable noise. When day appeared, the Romans, marching into the field in full vigor, after being thoroughly refreshed with sleep, at the first onset overpowered the Volscians, fatigued with standing and want of rest. However, the enemy might be said to retire, rather than to be routed, for some hills, which lay behind them, afforded a safe retreat to all the troops that were stationed to the rear of the first line, whose ranks were still unbroken. On coming to this place, where the height of the ground was against him, the consul ordered his men to halt, but it was with great difficulty that they could be restrained. They called out, and insisted on being allowed to pursue the advantage which they had gained, while the horsemen, collected round the general, were still more ungovernable, loudly declaring that they would advance before the front line. While Titus hesitated, between the confidence which he knew he might place in the valor of his men, and the difficulty of the ground, all cried out with one voice that they would proceed, and they instantly put their words in execution, sticking their spears in the ground, that they might be lighter to climb the steeps. They ran forward in full speed. The Volscians, having at the first onset discharged their missive weapons, began to pour down on them as they approached. The incessant blows from the stones of the higher ground, and which lay among their feet, so galled and disordered the Romans, that their left wing was by this means almost overborne, when the consul, just as they were beginning to give way, reproached them with their rashness, and at the same time with want of spirit, made their fears give place to shame. At first, they stood their ground with determined firmness; then, as they recovered strength to renew the attack, in spite of the disadvantage of situation, they ventured to advance, and raising the shout anew, moved forward in a body. Rushing on again in full career, they forced their way, and when they had reached almost to the summit of the hill, the enemy turned their backs, and the pursuers and pursued, exerting their utmost speed, both rushed into the camp together, almost in one body. In this consternation of the Volscians, their camp was taken. Such of them as could make their escape took the road to Antium; thither also the Roman army marched, and after a siege of a few days, the town surrendered, not because the force of the besiegers was stronger now than in the former attack, but because the spirits of the besieged were broken by the late unsuccessful battle, and the loss of their camp. End of Book 2, Part 10.